Today I'm going to be busting some common electronic drum myths, and I'm going to explore why I think that these myths persist, along with what actions can be taken to make sure that they don't become a reality. Let's get to it. Hey, welcome back to the eDrum Workshop. I'm Luke and I hope you're having a great day. We talk all things electronic and hybrid drum related on this channel, so hit the subscribe button and the bell so you don't miss any of my uploads. So we're going to try and dispel some electronic drum myths today and work out why these assumptions are made and how we can combat them. And this incredibly original idea that I decided to have turned out not to be quite as original as I'd thought. Justin from 65 Drums did a video like this a couple of years ago that I'd actually seen but I completely forgot about. So if you haven't seen that, go check it out after this one, it's great. And I purposely went back and re-watched that video so that I wouldn't accidentally overlap. Turns out there's enough shade thrown at electronic drums to make an entirely separate video. And these aren't in order of prominence of the myth, these are just in an order that made sense to me. So I'll begin with a couple that I think are a little bit debatable. Myth number 1. Electronic drums are easier to play than acoustic drums. The reason for that caveat there is that this can be true under certain circumstances, so I'm going to go into how you can avoid it while I explain it. The main arguments that I see people bring up about this topic are that the heads of electronic drums are typically bouncier, whether that's a mesh head or certain kinds of rubber pads, along with the footprint and the surface area of the pads being much closer together, making it easier to navigate the kit. So you get this sort of perfect storm of extra rebound and smaller physical motions, which can lead to you being able to pull some things off that you might not be able to on a full-size acoustic kit. If you couple this together with badly optimized trigger settings and less variation across the head, making every stroke a little bit more consistent, you actually get quite a compelling argument. In fact, I did a video a while ago about eDrum mistakes to avoid, and I focused quite heavily on these subjects. Now, one very simple counterpoint to this is that if you're not planning on regularly going back between acoustic and electronic drums, does this even matter? If you're mostly looking at playing electronic drums, especially for electronic purposes, this really might not matter to you. However, if you are planning on using acoustic drums regularly and you're mostly using your eDrums for acoustic drum practice or rehearsal, there are some pretty simple measures that you can put in place to make sure that this myth doesn't become true. I did address these in that video that I mentioned, but I'll give you a Cliff Notes version now. If you address that physical positioning, i.e. you make sure that all of your pads are spaced out more like an acoustic setup, or you have larger pad sizes to make your drums more actively resemble your acoustic kit, you can mitigate the spatial issue very easily. The bounciness of the mesh heads can be addressed by getting the best possible heads you can afford. A lot of people, myself included, will recommend Drumtech's Real Feel 3-ply heads, and you can also tune those mesh heads lower or loosen them up a little bit so that the feel becomes a bit closer to that of an acoustic kit, and you can't do things like buzz rolls on your floor toms, for example. You just need to keep an eye on things like trigger accuracy when you're loosening the heads. They can be affected by drastic tunings. You can also do some other simple things like switching up your sticks if you think that'll help, and some people have found some great success with muffling their mesh heads a little bit on the inside with some dampening material. And finally, you need to pay attention to the trigger settings and your technique. Make sure that you're setting up your triggers as accurately as possible, don't be topping out on mid-level strokes, and try to make sure that the dynamic range between your lowest and hardest hits is quite wide. And that's something that I will go into a little bit later on. Also, pay attention to where you're hitting the drums, try and be as central as possible unless you've got really bad hotspots. And typically speaking, a module that's got positional sensing will help you audibly hear, but it's not integral. If you keep all of these things in mind, your eDrums aren't going to be significantly easier to play. I mean, I'm never going to argue that they'll be harder to play, but if you're keeping these things all in check, then they're going to end up quite similar. I'm happy enough with this rebuttal to call this confidently busted. And this leads nicely into myth number 2. Learning to play on electronic drums makes you a worse drummer and will significantly hurt your technique. Now, this is one that I've got to be a little bit more careful with because I'm not a drum tutor and I don't have direct experience with that. However, as long as you're keeping all of the things from the last myth in mind, then you can minimize any potential risks. All of those aspects do play into this misconception, and of course it's going to be a lot more important for a newly starting drummer than an experienced one, and that's why I'm going to tread carefully with this. If you are a beginner drummer that's looking into electronic drums as an option, or if you've got kids, or family or friends that want to do so, make sure that you carefully read up on the capabilities of the drum kit that you're purchasing. Typically speaking, the cheaper kits will be less able to prevent these issues. So ask about, weigh up all of the pros and cons, and if you can, get some one-on-one tutoring. A drum tutor will be able to spot any problems with your technique and catch anything that might fall through the cracks. And if that isn't possible, then watch as many things as you can about things like hand technique, use a mirror, and learn to set your electronic drums up as accurately as you possibly can to an acoustic kit's dynamics. And preferably try and get onto an acoustic kit every now and then just for reference if you are planning on playing acoustic drums. I personally think if you're able to keep all of these things in mind and keep a good check on them all, then you can stop this myth from becoming a reality. But I don't doubt that some people have had issues if they've not been able to keep on top of it. So I'm happy to call this myth semi-busted. Myth number 3. Electronic drums aren't real drums. This drum kit that you can see me playing on right here, that drum kit exists. It is tangible, I can hit it, it makes a sound, and if it isn't real, then what am I doing here? Checkmate. Busted. Myth number 4. Electronic drums have a bad dynamic range. I think this one is a combination of quite a few factors, many of which I've just touched upon already, mixed in with the real world feeling of generating both very, very quiet and very, very loud sounds on an acoustic instrument, as well as the variety of complex tones and timbres that you can make with an acoustic instrument. These all whip up together to create the impression of a completely different kind of dynamic range, and the interactions between it all are pretty complex. Of course, badly optimized settings are going to give you a bad dynamic range on your eDrums, and really cheap modules are not going to be anywhere near as capable as the more expensive ones. Make sure that you set your eDrums up so that you actually have to work to hit that 127 velocity, and use whatever dynamic curve options you've got available to make the transition from low to high as natural as possible for your playing style. You need to do this as a baseline, otherwise any other comparisons past this point are pointless. And then beyond that, we need to define exactly what we mean by dynamics and dynamic range. The definition itself has been a point of contention in many of the arguments that I've seen people have about this subject. I think that some people group more things into dynamics than other people do. If we do a very cursory Google search about the definition of dynamics in relation to music, all of the definitions basically agree that dynamics relates to volume, but relative to other volumes as opposed to exact volume levels. So we're talking about the relationship from quietest to loudest as opposed to exact decibel readings. And where it starts to get a lot muddier is when you start to bring in all the different articulations that acoustic drums are capable of. This can affect things like perceived loudness. Where I would personally make the distinction is that certain articulations are going to actually change the perceived loudness and they should be included in the dynamic range, whereas other articulations will only really change the texture or the timbre of the sound and they probably shouldn't be included as part of the dynamic range. For example, you might be able to hit a rim shot that's got pretty much the exact same peak volume as a headshot on a recording, but all of the aspects that make up that rim shot, the character of the impact point, as well as the general change in tone and the sustain of the note that it creates, all mix together to create a perceived loudness that's louder than a straight up headshot. I think that if a rim shot attracts your ear's attention more readily and cuts through a mix more obviously than a headshot does, even if it's technically the same measured volume as the headshot, it probably still counts towards dynamic range variation. Different hits across the head of the drum that aren't really changing the perceived loudness, they're just kind of changing the character. They're the ones that start blurring the lines between what's dynamics and what's just like a textural difference. I personally think that's straying further into nuance and timbre than it is into the dynamics relating to volumes. Many drum modules are perfectly capable of going from extremely quiet to comparatively very, very loud like an acoustic drum can. If you take a recording of a snare drum being played with a stick from as quiet to as loud as possible, and then stack that up against a drum module that's performing the same kind of hits, I think you'll find that they both measure up pretty equally. And in fact, that's exactly what some drum modules have inside them. The Pearl Mimic Pro, the 2-box drum it range, the ATV85. These contain samples of people doing exactly that. Of course, they have different levels of detail in the sample layers and variations, but most of them then apply some kind of volume differences in order to compensate for that fact. I mean, you can technically have a really wide dynamic range even on a one-shot sample if you're going from really quiet to really loud, you just don't have any pleasing variations. So you can't currently get the same kind of nuance or variation out of electronic drums that you can out of an acoustic drum. But I would readily argue that the dynamic range is there as long as the module is reasonably capable. And also as long as we're comparing those hits in a fair way. How you feel that dynamic range though will definitely be very different, and that all comes down to the mechanics of acoustic versus electronic sound generation and the output of that sound. All of the air movement, the reverberations in the room, and the physicality of those interactions with an acoustic instrument will massively affect how you perceive that dynamic range when compared to an electronic kit coming through some speakers. Also, you've got the fact that the relationship between the different dynamic levels of an acoustic instrument aren't entirely linear. The relative volumes and loudness compared to your force can change depending on the drum. But I think that you can remedy this with good use of trigger settings to the point where it's almost negligible for the sake of this argument. So I would personally call this busted. But feel free to disagree with me or add to this down in the comments. That was a surprisingly deep and detailed one. Myth number 5 is going in a slightly different direction because this one comes from eDrummers themselves. Electronic drums let you practice nearly silently. This is very circumstantial, and again it's another thing that's reasonably relative. But unfortunately this misconception leads a lot of people to believe that they'll be able to play their eDrums at any time of day, no matter what their housing situation is, until they inevitably get a knock on the door from a very irate neighbour. There's so many factors involved in how the transference of the sound that you're creating is affected. You've got the material of your building, what other things you've got in your room, which walls are joined to which neighbours, what floor you're on in your building, and so on and so on. Electronic drums are much quieter than their acoustic counterparts, and they'll let some people play whenever they want without ever affecting their neighbours. But they're not even close to silent, and for a lot of people they won't be the magical solution that they were looking for. Much more manageable than acoustic drums, but still something that you've got to use considerately and probably limit to certain times a day so that you're not annoying every person around you. The vibrations from a kick drum pedal through the floor alone can travel really far through the right materials. And there are of course plenty of things that you can do to mitigate this. And some people will say try setting up your acoustic kit for a day and see how they like that. But I wouldn't recommend that. Speak to your neighbours, find out what they can hear, whichever way you want to go about it. And if you need to, work out times that are appropriate to play and not to play. And you wouldn't need to do any of this if they were silent, so busted. And finally, another one that I've seen quite a few people inside the eDrum scene bandying about. eDrums will make acoustic drums obsolete in the future. Nah. I think that when the technology for eDrums does get to the point where you can pretty much perfectly replicate an acoustic kit, we'll definitely see a lot more people using them for their inherent volume and practicality purposes. And in that regard, they might even become the most used variation of the instrument. But no matter how good electric guitars get, acoustic guitars aren't entirely obsolete. And grand pianos haven't been completely finished off by digital pianos either. And I've argued against comparisons between electric guitars and eDrums before, but I think in this respect there's a lot of similarities. Acoustic drums are always going to be a tool to get a particular sound, and that feel aspect that we touched on before is probably always going to remain a huge draw. And even if we do get to the point where we can solidly replicate that feeling, I don't think that obsolescence is on the horizon. Ultimately, tools will always still have their uses even if new tools come along. The uses might diminish comparatively, but they're very unlikely to completely go away. And of course, where are we going to get our amazing multi-layered samples from for our eDrums if acoustic drums don't exist anymore? Busted. What do you think about my myth-busting skills? Have I done a good job or have I completely missed the mark? And are there any other myths that I've missed or that Justin didn't touch on in his video either? Let me know down in the comments, maybe there'll be enough suggestions for another video in the future. If you enjoyed this video, why not pop a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you want anything else like this? And why not share it with your drummer friends who are always bleating on about electronic drums not being real drums, man? Check out any of the videos up on the screen, have a look over on my website if you want any sound expansions or samples for your module, and enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!